Hey, Hunter. Thank you so much for making time for me and for NQAPIA, and most importantly, for this topic that oftentimes is not discussed enough. So I'm very glad to be here. I know it's been hard to get a hold of me. It is our kind of like holiday season, and for NQAPIA, it is May for API Heritage Month and then June for Pride Month as well. So I'm so happy that I'm here to discuss these issues.
Oh, it's so good to have you here, Kenrick. Thank you for making the time. And yeah, it really is sort of perfect to be talking about the intersectionalities as we are going from 1 month and we'll be going into Pride Month next month. And I hope you're back for some talks there as well, if we can book you. I know you're a busy person. So Kenrick, let's back up a little bit. So you were born in Guyana and then you were raised in the New York City area. So what else, what can you tell me a bit about your personal journey, how it involved your passion for activism? You know, when did you move here? Did some of that experience where you were born, was that carried over? Do you have memories of that? Bring me back in time with you a bit.
Sure, absolutely. So I was born in Guyana, which at that time, I think now Guyana is known more for recent oil deposits, for example. But at that time, coming to the United States, most people who had ever thought they heard of Guyana was either Jim Jones, the tragedy that happened in 1979, or they mistook it with Ghana in Africa. So there was a lot of culture shock coming as a 7-year-old from not just a very small country, geographically in South America, culturally Caribbean, which adds to kind of the confusion, but coming from a very rural upbringing as a child and landing in the middle of this kind of like super urban landscape, which was Jersey City, New Jersey. And, you know, I would say that the part of my journey, getting acclimated to growing up in Jersey City, I went to undergrad and grad school in New York City, and a few other things, is that compared to other stories that I've heard from friends, from colleagues, from fellow movement leaders, I've always been in a space of super diversity, which, looking back on it, of course, particularly as a child, you want a space where everybody looks like you, sounds like you, is similar to you. I never had that, and probably that doesn't really exist, right? I am a multiracial, gay Guyanese man. I've never found a room where everybody is the same, more than 3 other people at any given time. So that probably was going to be a non-possibility. But I will say that the choice between being, as many of my friends experience, let's say the only BIPOC person in school, or among the very few, for example, in a mostly white environment, versus being in Jersey City, which was for much of the last 20 years among the most diverse ethnically, culturally, linguistically places in America, I would have chosen, and I'm happy to have been in the latter. So that was my upbringing among many, many different cultures, ethnicities, languages, faith traditions, socioeconomic diversity as well. And in some ways, certainly by circumstance, but also by choice, much of my professional life has been in spaces of diversity, or what I think of as kind of like the new America or the next America. I think I'm relatively unusual that I've always reported, for example, to women of color. And when we talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, that's how we promote folks into positions of authority, how we support women of color into leadership. That's a conversation. So the fact that all my bosses have been women of color, all my teams have been beautifully diverse, has been kind of like an outlier for me. And I think there are two things that come from those experiences, both personal and professional. One is that when not everybody's like you, and when you've gotten over that hurdle of wanting everybody to be like you start having a lens of who else is not there. So how do
Mm,
we make the room bigger? How do we make a table longer? Um, how do we assure that more voices are in that room? Because you understand that you bring a marginalized perspective and you bring a one of many perspectives. And I think the other part of that is understanding that you are in that room, particularly whatever the intersections as LGBTQ, API, immigrant, because people made intentional choices that have never met you, probably never imagined you, to open up that space, um, to open that door into those rooms so someone like you can walk through. And I think for me, every time the work of activism or the work of leadership gets really, really hard, and it does get really, really hard and frustrating, that is something I go back to, that people have done this intentionally for me without ever imagining me. And my way of being grateful is to do that for other people who I may not imagine as part of my leadership practice.
that's beautiful. What I'm extrapolating there is gratitude is bringing you into action. That's so powerful. I'm gonna keep that above my computer. And when I'm having my down days, I'm gonna go to that. So tell me about the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance and its mission, and so how this is your channel, your platform, your tools for activism now.
Sure. So NQAPIA is 17 years old. We were formed in 2005, and I have been executive director for exactly 2 years. So we are in a stage of growth, adulting in some ways. In terms of the age of the organization, we are the national organization engaging, empowering, uplifting LGBTQ people who identify as Asian, Asian American, Pacifica, um, in the United States and the territories. So our core work falls into, I guess, three buckets. The first is capacity building, and that is kind of the foundation of the work when it started in 2005. So we do capacity building in three ways. We do capacity building for grassroots organizations that are devoted to serving LGBTQ APIs. So we are in collaboration, conversation, community in terms of that capacity building work with about 60 organizations in 15 states and 2 territories. And what we do, we provide everything from leadership training to advising on fundraising to small grants to fiscal sponsorship. Because most of those organizations are volunteer run, very small budgets, even smaller number of hands to help to do the work. So in that way, we provide as many resources as we can to help them create space and help them create programming in the places where they're located. The second part of capacity building is to ensure that larger LGBTQ and API organizations are doing a better job of serving LGBTQ API folks. That is an ongoing conversation to help them. What can we do to help them build their own capacity to serve those particular parts of their constituencies? And the third part is building the leadership capacity of LGBTQ APIs across the country. Whether or not you are running a movement organization, you're running an LGBTQ organization, you're running an API organization. We want to put you in network, put you in conversation so you have a support network of folks that share some of your background. The second work we do is federal policy advocacy. And our topics range very much like the other movement organizations, everything from immigration to voting rights, to addressing the tidal wave of anti-trans legislation rolling across the country right now. And the third part is research and resource development to make sure that we're doing the outreach when surveys are done and studies are done. So LGBTQ API folks are not, sample size too small. So our perspectives, our positions, and our numbers are represented in data. And then when that data is converted into actual resources, there's enough data, there's enough narrative that resources are culturally and linguistically competent so they could actually be useful to the people we serve.
That's really incredible. There's so many, you're involved in so many steps of the process there.
Yes.
I'm really curious about, I think it was step 2, when you're like really helping like the people in the movement and connecting them with people. And so what does that look like if that's someone that's coming to you? Let's say someone is hearing this right now and they're like, oh, wow, I want to get involved. Sounds like this is something that I could use. What does that look like?
So basically it looks like sending us a message at info@nqapia.org. And from there, we will do like an intake process to assess where you are in your ideation. So some folks are looking to support efforts, for example. So they want to get involved. Let's say, they are a queer trans API person in Los Angeles, and they want to find resources or they want to find a place to volunteer. We can link them to one of the 4 groups that we work with in LA. But there are many parts of the country, most parts of the country, where there's no infrastructure like we have in LA, San Francisco, New York, DC, for LGBTQ API organized activism. So folks come to us all the time and are like, I'm on a campus, or I'm in St. Louis, or I'm in Kansas City, and I would love to do something as simple as creating a potluck every month, or I would, love to do a film series. And lo and behold, we have organizations that do those kinds of things among the 65. So we would work with you to say, we can connect you to one of the organizations so they can share their best practices and their pitfalls about how you put together your programming. And then as you grow, as you look to sustainability, if that is what you want to do. Some people are like, look, this was fun for this, or this was interesting, or this is just too hard, particularly during the pandemic, right? When people's attention and their time has been so warped. We saw a lot of groups, for example, shut down programming or have to do more self and community care than outward programming. But let's say you're like, look, we've been doing these potlucks for 6 months, or we've been doing these like monthly meetings, food tours, bar crawls, whatever it is. But we want to do something a little bit deeper. We want to talk about policy issues. Then we also step in and say, okay, well, we can connect you to these kinds of resources, and eventually we can help you fundraise. So you don't have to be a 501c nonprofit. We can do that for you. And for 20 organizations across the country, that is the way they fundraise, and that is the way they are able to put on their programming, because we are the back end for a lot of their administration and their finances.
What an incredible and powerful resource for so many people, I imagine, because a lot of people can have ideas, but then they can just be totally lost, and passion and drive, but can be in the weeds about some of this back end stuff that is necessary for all of it to happen.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a lot of the technical pieces, the compliance pieces, that when we think of the work, it's where a lot of folks find barriers, right? Particularly with 501c3 nonprofit status, it's pretty much the threshold to access any kind of funding, from small dollar funding on Act Blue to certainly foundations and corporations. So to have that as a resource, I think, is very important for our community, and to have us continue to provide that resource as well.
Yeah. So can we talk about a bit about, there's so you help people along these different ways. Sometimes it can be about getting the message out, but there's an importance, there's a perception out there, right, of representation and misrepresentation. So can we talk about the representation of the LGBTQI plus API community in the media? Are you seeing a positive change there, or is it two steps forward, one step back, two steps back, three steps back, one step forward? You mentioned the tidal wave of anti-trans bills, that's part of public, it's in news cycles, right? And there's all this, but then there's also, TV, movie, characters, stuff like that. So there's all this stuff coming at us. How do we parse it out? Where do you think we're at right now?
So, I will preface this by saying that there is an impossibility about capturing the true spectrum of LGBTQ API experiences, cultures, ethnicities, right? So the more we see representations in the media, whether that is like movies like Crazy Rich Asians, now we have a few shows on Hulu, we have a lot of books being written, for example. I would say for us, it is largely positive. Having more diverse representations of LGBTQ API folks is super important. So I think that is thing one, or step one, to just make the case that our stories are valuable and they should be visible. And not just to us within the community, but to the wider community. So I can't remember her name right now, but there was a film last year, I think won an Oscar maybe. It was an animated film, and a critic in Canada said, well, this is about Asians, so it's not going to be widely accessible. And that is not true, because everybody who is non-white has been consuming media by and about white folks for generations, and they have been doing that without saying, oh well, we cannot. So I think all stories are accessible if you invest in them. At the same time, I think we have to be intentional about creating space for more diverse stories. And at NQAPIA, when we do our programming, so a lot of our programming is around what do we do on a national level? Because we don't have the capacity to do things on a local level, for example. We can support stuff that's happening on a local level through the groups that work there. So for example, we're, when we choose to highlight cultural events or things like that, we want to make sure that, one, we are being as inclusive as possible. And Carla was talking before I got on about the PI, or the Pacifica part of API. That's really important, particularly for somebody like me. I don't fit the stereotype that many people have within and outside API communities of what a API person, much less the leader of a national organization for API folks, should look like. And so we really want to challenge that in what we're highlighting, uplifting. And that goes with ethnicities. We want to make sure that Southeast Asian stories, Muslim stories, Black Asian stories, Pacifica stories are represented in what we're highlighting and uplifting and what we're encouraging people to make space for. At the same time, we also want to make sure that trans experiences, intersex experiences, non-binary experiences are also part of that storytelling. And if they can intersect each other, even better.
Yeah, and like you said, there's so many, right? And there isn't going to be one story that identifies with everyone. And I love your point too about just that ludicrous statement from that critic that it's unrelatable because they weren't that identity. And it's like, no, but literally everyone else has been doing that with it, most of media. Yeah. So can we talk, and we only have a few minutes left, but can you talk a bit about capacity building, right? You mentioned that a little bit earlier, and what that is and why it's important and how you help do that.
So as I was mentioning, a lot of this is around providing back-end resources, you would call it, the admin, the fiscal supports for various groups across the country. And that could look very differently for different groups. So for example, we help groups put together steering committees. We help them with their fundraising. During Pride Month, we usually do a small grants program. Groups that want to have a float in a Pride parade and can't afford that. So we will put some resources to that. So that's, I think, the more accessible ways we provide that capacity building support. And I think probably just as equally important is the fact that we are a national organization that does provide that support. So we are a place where people can come and say, I would like to do this. I don't know how to make it happen. And the fact that we can help people make it happen, that every year we're helping at least half a dozen different groups launch, is really important to us, because a lot of the groups that we're working with, yes, policy change is sexy, civic engagement is sexy, but space building is also super, super essential. To have on a college campus a safe space to meet monthly, or to have in a city where, many cities are now becoming increasingly hostile to LGBTQ folks. Well, the states, and that is permeating into cities. Have just a support network is essential.
Yeah, it's so important. And it's great to hear how something as practical as like, oh, I just need to get a float so we can be seen, in the parade. It's part of it. It's part of it. You also made me chuckle a little bit with policy building is sexy. So I was like, yeah, it's got like a hot track quality to it, but there's so many other things that need to be done for anything to happen.
Yes. You got to build a base to shift policy, and that's something like we have been doing in very distinct ways of getting people into community. And that's the first step towards telling them, well, these are things that are happening and we need your help to push back against them. And something that I always say when it comes to policy shift is that 2 years ago, we didn't, well, 5 years ago, there weren't many anti-LGBTQ bills anywhere across the country, right? After marriage equality, there was this sigh moment where people are like, well, what is the next big policy fight? A lot of organizations shut down, shifted resources. We are in the thick of confronting dozens of anti-LGBTQ, particularly anti-trans bills, almost on a weekly basis. So it is going to be a fight, seat by seat, state by state, legislature by legislature, bill by bill, and building a base across the country where we engage folks. And it could be the entry point, it could be a cultural event, but to say, hey, the difference in terms of shifting policy in your area might be a few hundred votes. So it's not just you, it's every person you know. And that's how we shift policy.
Yeah. And so we're seeing this tidal wave of anti-LGBT, mostly anti-trans, are largely bills. And so we're seeing a rise in discrimination, from the Trevor report that we mentioned earlier, folks, young folks reporting discrimination, their race, their ethnicity, and non-binary folks reporting, and those numbers are going up. We saw violence against the API community as a whole, that was rising during the pandemic. So there's all these things happening. And so I'm curious what members of the community and allies can do to help make a change on a grassroots level. There's ways that they can get involved.
Absolutely. And I always preface this that these are institutional changes and policy changes and structural issues around everything from gun violence to the way we profoundly fail people around mental health in this country and around the world. But this is also on a very personal level, the targets our children, right? It's the the boogeymen or people of a lot of the anti-trans bills are drag queens and children and educators and parents. And what is common in that subset of people is that they're vulnerable because they're trying their best to navigate many different things at the same time. So one is that we all know how it is to be different in a school setting for something or the other, right? It doesn't have to be your gender identity or expression. It could be many different things. It could be neurodivergence, it could be height, whatever, right? But most of us know how it is to be and how difficult that is to navigate. Imagine a national conversation about why you shouldn't exist. That is going to permeate into the self-esteem, that is going to permeate into the entire ecosystem of your daily existence. So we need everybody else to stand up because the people who are most targeted right now are the most vulnerable and cannot really do that for themselves. You have a lot of parents trying to navigate basic health care and avoid jail in some places. Teachers, right? Avoiding being fired for saying a word. They cannot also be activists, and they need folks who are allies. So if you want to be an ally, support organizations across the board, and not just give money, but learn what we're doing, learn what the actions are. For example, learn things like public comments for rules. It's a hard thing to do, but for example, there's a public comment period now around Title IX to help to protect trans kids in playing sports. That is open until May 15th. Google it, every organization across the board, and copy it to GLSEN, to HRC. We'll show you how to send a message to the Biden administration that this is important and this rule should go into effect. At the same time, try to combat disinformation, right? Particularly around the anti-trans issues. And they have chosen a very vulnerable population, trans folks, because they believe within a larger LGBTQ movement, trans folks are distinctly vulnerable, and they can disaggregate them from the LGB part. And there is substance there. So this is not just about non-LGBTQ people. This is also LGBTQ folks need to get right on this issue and realize that, you know, it's not just that trans folks are part of our community, but we're all in this together, because this is just a start of removing marginalized people from public life in this country. And we have not seen a movement like this for about 60 years.
Yeah, it's so important to get involved in the grassroots level, you know, to do that research, to make sure, you know, help reach out to companies and nonprofits that are fighting the good fight. And, you know, like Title IX, like you said, is a great example. So how can folks find out more information about NQAPIA and how they can stay connected to you, Kenrick?
So for NQAPIA, it is nqapia.org. We don't have the best website, but a new one is coming along the way. But basic information about what we do, NQAPIA across social media, particularly Instagram, is the best way to find out what we're doing and what we're up to. And for me, increasingly LinkedIn is the best way to reach me if you want to discuss issues in greater detail. If you want to learn more about my cats and things like that, other social media, but it's LinkedIn.
Totally.
If anybody's also interested in LGBTQ inclusive sports and fitness, that is something that is very, very close to my heart. And so also intersects with the work particularly we're doing around schools and sports and trans kids, but I'm always up for talking about that and getting people more involved.
I love that. Kenrick, thank you so much for making the time today. I'm going to follow you on LinkedIn. My dog is going to message you on Instagram so we can, you know, swap dog and cat conversations. We're going to hit all the platforms, okay?
Fantastic. Thank you again, Hunter, for making time. This has been a great conversation, and I look forward to continuing it.
I hope so, and we hope to have you back. Thank you again.
Have a great afternoon.